If you've seen my previous video, you know I'm working on a robust woodworking workbench, which I've equipped with a bench table saw with a sliding carriage. In this third video, I'll show you how to build and use this router table to get even more out of your workbench. In this new design, I've decided to place the router table to the right of the saw. The router is encased within a module fitted with a door so that I can access it. Thanks to this, I've managed to reduce the noise it makes almost by half. In the inside of the module, I've put a power outlet for the router, which I can control with an emergency switch. This is the insert plate for the router. I've made it with a HPL panel, but it could also be made out of aluminum or any plastic board that is tough and thick enough, around 10 millimeters. Another possibility would be to buy the insert. They're very easy to find nowadays and also pretty affordable. After removing the 4 screws on the top, it's easy to access the router and its fixed base, to which I've screwed the bottom part of the insert, using the same screws that come with the base. This base has a screw for adjusting the height of the router bits by turning the screw from below and above. Here we can see the 4 pieces of board which allow me to fasten the insert to the bench top. Each one of them has 2 bolts which allow me to adjust the height of the insert to leave it at the same height as the bench top. I've changed the original design a little, making a rabbet in the table so that I can place the insert, and I've used headless screws which are screwed to the insert itself to adjust its height. Both of these systems are perfectly valid. These are the insert rings, which can be swapped depending on the diameter of the router bit we're going to use. I've also made them with a HPL panel that's less thick. The rings could also be made from aluminum, plastic boards, or hardwood. And this is a hex key which I fitted with a simple wooden handle. I'll use it to raise or lower the router. I'm going to run a few tests to show off some of the router's functions. First, I'll place a chamfer bit with a bearing. I'll also use the lead-on pin to make it easier to mill small or curved pieces such as these. Now I'll install the fence for making other kinds of cuts. I've used T-track profiles and T-screws to fix the fence to the workbench. I've also used 2 aluminum profiles which I can adjust by loosening 2 screws in the back. These kinds of profiles are very versatile and work really well for these fences, but you could also use boards or other kind of aluminum profiles like the ones used for making CNC tools. They will also allow me to use miter track stops for cuts like these, where I'm making a pull for the router cabinet door. I bring the profiles up to the bit, lock the fence, and make a fairly substantial cut in this piece of oak wood. I still need to finish installing the dust collection system, which I'll do in the next video in the series. I've swapped the bit for another one with more diameter, and tried the router again with the same piece of oak. As you may have seen, I've installed a miter channel on the workbench, which will let me use a feather board for complex or repetitive cuts. I'll need a different feather board for use with a fence. I'll design one later. The same profile will let me use a miter gauge for both straight and angled cuts. To build the bench, I've used a base of hard plywood screwed to another board. It's a kind of MDF board, but harder and with melamine on both sides. In the original design, I used a single hard plywood piece. Both options are correct. We could even use other kinds of boards, such as a standard MDF or plastic boards. As you can see in this 3D model, this design has a folding extension in the back of the bench that will provide me with a much larger work table for cutting big work pieces. This insert, the fence, and the table could be easily adapted to whichever workbench you have at home without the need to build the whole work table. It can also be used with almost any kind of router, such as the ones that have a fixed plunge base. If you're interested in the plans for this design, I'll leave a link in the video description. Now I'll show you how to make this router table. First of all, we have to screw on these two pieces of plywood to achieve a larger support surface for the router table. Now I'll cut these two pieces of board to size for making the table itself. I mark and drill the necessary holes to join the two top pieces together. I follow the same steps to make the holes that will let me attach the table to the cabinet. After making sure the table is in the right place, I screw it on with 15mm long screws. I'm going to make some grooves for the T-track profiles, which will let me fix the fence of the router. I'll use a plunge router and a piece of wood as a guide. Once the grooves have been cut, I screw the profiles onto the table. I've marked the exact position of the router insert on the bench top. I drilled some holes so that I can insert the jigsaw blade and make the necessary cuts. I'll cut 2mm short of the line and later finish cutting the recess with a router. Now I'll cut the piece that I will use as router insert. I'll use the insert I've just cut to fine-tune the adjustable router template guide. I place it on the table and finish the recess for the insert with the router and a flush trim router bit. These are the pieces that will secure the insert to the table. I screw them to the table and glue another 9mm piece of plywood for some added thickness. I mark each of their positions and drill new holes. Some are for the threaded inserts, and the others are for the screws that will make it possible to regulate the height of the insert. For the latter, I'll use a bit whose diameter is 0.5mm smaller than the screws I'll be using, in this case a 5mm bit. I'm going to make some new holes in the miter channel adapted to my design. Two of them will be over the two plywood pieces I've just screwed on. I'll use a bolt with its head cut off to mark on the insert plate the exact position of the screws that will fix it to the table. Once these are made, I screw the table back onto the bench one last time by inserting all of the screws. It's time to mark and drill all the necessary holes in the insert so that we can fasten the router fixed base. I'll also make a hole that will act as a rotation axis to cut a recess for the insert rings. I've glued the printable template, pulling it back 15 millimeters. I'm doing this because in the future I want to make a new and improved router lift, and I'm probably going to need some more space on the front of the insert to insert a screw that will make it possible to lift and lower the router. I've attached the circle cutting jig to the plunge router, and before anything else, I run a test with a piece of MDF to make sure the diameter is correct. The first cut will be about 5 millimeters deep, half the thickness of the insert. The second one will be 5 millimeters further toward the center, cutting completely through. I made sure everything is correct by screwing the fixed base to the insert, and it seems that it is. Before moving on, I'm going to thread the hole for the lead-on pin for curved cuts. I'm also going to glue 2 pieces of plywood to a hex key to move the router up and down more comfortably. It's time to make the insert rings. I'm going to make them out of HPL, but you could use acrylic boards or aluminum. I mark the diameter on the board, drill the central holes, and cut out the rings in the bandsaw. I'll finish making them with a jig with an axis and the sanding disc. They're a little thicker than the rabbet in the insert. I'll sand one of their sides down until they're the right thickness. Now I'll cut the necessary pieces to make a fence. I'm going to use bits of birch hardwood plywood with white melamine on both sides I had lying around in my workshop. I could also use plywood without melamine and varnish it. I drill all the necessary holes and screw the 3 pieces together. I'll use bits of the same board to make reinforcements. I make sure they're square and screw them to the fence. With a miter saw, I'll cut the aluminum profile. One of the cuts will be at a 45-degree angle. I'm going to fasten them to the fence with nuts and bolts. I'll also attach the flange adapter that will allow me to connect the dust collector pipe. I've made some changes to the original design in the plans. Both methods are perfectly valid. For the fence's tightening knobs, we could use some plastic ones in many different varieties. In my case, I'm going to make them with pieces of a board to take advantage of the full length of the screws. The knobs will be placed higher than the fence, which I think will make them more comfortable to use. I make holes for the threaded inserts, glue the printable template to mark the cuts, and make sure everything works as intended. Now I'm going to cut and machine the back of the router table. Since I don't have too much space to work with due to the folding table I'll put in the back of the bench, I'm going to place the flange adapter for dust extraction on the inside of the back. After screwing on the adapter, I only have to screw the back to the workbench. In the same way, I'll cut the router table door. I'll use MDF with a beech veneer. You could also use any other kind of board that's at least 16 millimeters thick. I'll use the bench table saw to cut a recess for the acrylic. We could use a router instead. I'll use a rabbit router bit to cut a rabbit in the acrylic. With a column drill, I make holes for the hinges and swap bits again to make a built-in handle in the door. I'll use the miter track stops as router stops, even though I only have one for now. I'll now screw the conceal hinges to the door and cut the acrylic to size. With some pieces of chestnut wood, I'll make moldings to fasten the acrylic to the door. I'll glue them on with cyanoacrylate. Now all that's left is to put the door in its emplacement. I've used a shelf support as a stop. That's all for today. In a few days I'll upload a new video showing you how to make a blast gate box for sawdust.